Good to be here with everybody. Mako Ali Tonali. My name is Michael Lechuga. Um, my grandparents are uh, Antonio Lechuga and Lydia Lechuga. And on my mother's side, my grandfather is Manuel Alarcon, and my grandmother, who I really look to as an inspiration in my life, both in what she's taught me about my culture and as a migrant herself, Maria del Carmen Alarcon. My mountains are the Sierra de los Mansos, and the river that I grew up next to is um, called Rio Bravo, or Rio Grande, as our previous speaker already mentioned. And I talk about myself in this way because there's a very specific connection to an indigenous cultural history that we have for those of us who are from Turtle Island. In this particular area that I'm coming from is Tiwa territory, but I originally hail from further south. The presentation that I'm going to give to you today is going to speak a little bit to my cultural heritage, but also the relationship between what indigeneity is and its connection to migrants today in this part of the world. And this relationship also as it persists in our contemporary global modernity, which is characterized by a colonial nationalism that still persists in creating national structures that then criminalize and produce violent structures that, as we've already heard, create quite a bit of vulnerability for migrating communities. In 2018, the Trump administration of the United States struck from its language, the United States Customs and Border Enforcement, that the United States began as a nation of migrants, which was interesting. For years, the United States had sort of prided itself as being a nation of migrants. And author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who wrote the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, celebrated this. She actually is not a Trump supporter, but she has for years been trying to make this case that colonizers are different than migrants. Making this very clear is part of her work, and I think part of the work that I'm drawing on in describing my own research and then presenting you my research on narratives today. But really, this understanding of what a colonizer is, what colonization does to territories, how it's produced nationalisms in continents like Turtle Island or throughout Abya Yala and throughout Africa, makes us then have, my opinion, a different understanding of what migrants are, what nationalism is, and how we might be able to undo some of these structures to create more liberating experiences for those people who do migrate from countries who have been colonized as such. So if I had to sort of characterize three guiding questions in my broad research and the research that brought me to this collaboration with my amazing colleagues, it would be this: is what is it behind this alien narrative that persists in the United States' political imaginary, beyond the invasion and beyond the kind of technological capacity to produce these images of violent let's say immigrants crossing the border with thermal images, or the media in the United States who has a capacity to overstate the threat that migrants pose. There is something about this connection to our entertainment industries, in particular the way that we frame alienhood. So in another book that I've written, I speak specifically about that relationship. I've also spoken a little bit about technology. And I think that one of the ways we can conceptualize how this migrant narrative perpetuates is through the technologies that are often used at the US-Mexico border and other places. For example, many of the US-Mexico border technologies were developed in collaboration with the Israeli military to patrol, borders not only here but throughout the world. The relationship then is, for me, a storytelling narrative. These technologies allow for a story to be told about a particular group, which is oftentimes untrue, but perpetuates a particular political and ideological paradigm within this settler colonial construct in the United States. All of this for me produces what I call racial citizenship. Racial citizenship, particularly in the United States, but I think throughout the West, where we see citizenship paradigms that are rooted in nativist and nationalist issues, are in fact also rooted in racist assumptions about the kinds of migrants that come. One of the stories I like to tell is no, I don't like to tell. But one of the stories that I typically tell about this sort of like imbalance about racial citizenship is the way Ukrainian refugees appeared at U.S. ports and U.S. Airports, when were given preferential treatment to others who come from places like Venezuela, Cuba, and at the time had to sort of wait in line. There was a racialized assumption that the people who were coming from a NATO country had more right to access the resources of the United States than those who didn't necessarily come from those countries. We see this also, as the previous guest mentioned, with Haiti, and it's very clear that there's an anti-Blackness rooted in the assumptions that Haitian refugees bring criminality and other things, as popularly portrayed in our media. So for me, then, I understand the colonial narratives and the way that they produce the other, the way they produce a particular kind of racialized alien migrant that then gets mixed into our United States and really Western colonial political narratives. I draw from this, I draw from three researchers primarily to frame this. And I've mentioned them here, Linda Alcoff and the problem of speaking for others. And for me, the reason this is important is because oftentimes we just assume that the narratives that are perpetuated by our media, by our politicians, by people in positions of power are true narratives. The underlying power that goes in naming yourself, that allows ourselves to reject or remove the assumptions that are put onto us by people who are narrating our lives, is one of the things Linda Alcoff is really attuned to. Not only in my own work, but in the volume that we collaborated on, this power of allowing migrants to speak for themselves, describe their own relationships to their own sets of cultural values, ethnic values, sometimes indigenous values, aren't things that oftentimes get narrated in popular media. And this is one of the reasons why I pull from Linda Alcoff. Lorenzo Veracini is another author that I pull from, who talks specifically about the way settler colonialism and colonialism in general produces populations. And this is also in line with what Patrick Wolf has mentioned, in that race such as Black and Indian were invented as part of this colonial nationalistic logic. All of this to me is really important because it provides us a backdrop for why then the imperative to continue anti-immigrant policies, both in terms of like humanitarian aid or in terms of like militarized regulation, seem to do the same thing. They seem to take groups of people who were otherwise indigenous to these continents, turn them into foreigners, and then sort of embed them into a colonial society where they serve as a second-class citizenship. So in general, the reason I think this is important for us as communication scholars and as people who are attuned to the narratives of migrants is that we must understand that these narratives organize our feelings and our thoughts about migrant communities. Narratives, especially those that are made with media technologies or technologies of surveillance like those at the border, help to tell this story of invasion that is oftentimes the dominant narrative. I would suggest that rejecting colonial narratives, and especially for migrant communities who can narrate their own lives and expressions, is an expression of anti-colonial sovereignty. And I think that's really why, for me, this collaboration with my colleagues was so important. I want to just give you a brief example of one of these kinds of expressions of migrants narrating their own sovereignty. And this happened in 2019. On the right-hand side of the screen, I'm not sure if it's flipped or inverted, so excuse me. On the side of the screen that is illuminated more, you see Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. On the left-hand side is El Paso, Texas, the United States. And there's a canal that used to be a river, the same river that I call my home, El Rio Grande, that was made into a 4-mile concrete canal to permanently divide the United States from Mexico at this point. And typically you would see sort of the same thing: searchlights, surveillance equipment, people looking on the other side. But what you're looking at here at this particular moment is an installation by Rafael Hemer, who's an immigrant and who's an artist, who decided to install sets of spotlights that would cast across the United States-Mexico border. And instead of using these spotlights to, illuminate migrants or to try to highlight people who were crossing without authorization, they were used to connect with people on the other side. So people in Juarez could connect with people in El Paso. If you pointed your lights at each other, it would create a sort of channel, and a microphone and a speaker would open, and you could start telling each other stories and connecting with people from across the border. This sort of imagination that migrants have about what borders do and what borders can't do. Borders can't stop communication. They can't stop the lights. And for him to implement this logic into this resistance art piece, for me, shows the capacity that migrants have, again, to dictate their own capacities, to dictate their own sovereignty, and really have agency that isn't offered to them when their lives are narrated for them. Again, when migrant and border communities are given the access to narrative tools, not just the capacity to tell a story, but the technologies to tell those stories too, big, bright, beautiful worlds can be built. And I say this because this is really the premise of our book, Migrant World Making. I'm happy to answer any questions about this collaborative process, but I also want to step out of the way and let my fabulous colleagues speak on their contributions to the book.